Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. And today is Popcast 89. It's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 39. We're going to finish up with Hoffer today, in part because I'm kind of bored with it. I think, just one more look at some of the complex psychological reasons that people fall into hate is all we need. I've decided to, look ahead now because I'm going to quit at episode 100 for a week or so and, figure out where I'm going to go from there, do some reading, etc. But in the meantime, I will at the last some days of this, remaining group. Let's see what today is. So we have, including today, we have 12 episodes. So the last three or four are going to be, some kind of a summary. And between now and then, I want to deal with owning sacred literature. I want to, talk more about what we're learning about sacred literature and its arising from deep within ourselves. Only if we're comfortable that we own sacred literature, that it's part of humanity, that it's an expression of a psychological a psychological phenomena that seems to be occurring in all of us, the sense of awe, the sense of sacred, about ourselves and the world we come from, then we don't have what we need to see the relation of religion and psychology. And we really do need to appreciate that relation in order to bring in people who either are not themselves believers or who may well be believers but think that public life should be separate from religious life. We need to show that religion is one thing and our psychological sense of the sacred is something else. It's the source of religion, but it's different from religion. It's where religion starts from. And accepting the seeming phenomena of our psychological sense of the sacred at the core of us then allows all of us, believers and non-believers, and people who think religion should be separate from public affairs, to see that we need to affirm this psychological spirituality as a part of public life. Since it's the core of our personality and it's where we get our connection to each other refreshed and sanctified, made part of the sacred, we need it in order to keep from falling into the great divide with, double doses of hatred on top. And though we'll continue to have a divide about all of the issues of how best to organize our social arrangements and how best to live the gift of each other, we can get the two doses of hate toppings off of the great divide and turn it into a mere disagreement about, how best to do what we're all setting out to do together and see that we're trying to do together. We constantly have to refresh hope. While it springs eternal, it will become infertile if it isn't shared. It's kind of like the seed, needs to go to ground in order to germinate. Hope needs to be shared in order to have the effect that it needs to have, both on our individual lives and on our collective lives. We can't live our collective lives without shared hope. And So this appreciation of the difference between religion and our psychological sense of sacredness is improved by seeing that our sacred writings arise from our sense of the sacred. Um, and it is not an offense against any God you believe in to see that God put the sense of the sacred in ourselves and allowed ourselves to speak these words, which seem very much to be coming from the sense of the sacred within us. It that regularly rises up from within, that updwells. So that that's an important aspect of being able to see the difference between religion and psychology as far as sacredness goes, and thereby getting people who either don't believe or don't think that religion should be part of public life to be comfortable that it's not religion that we're making part of public life. It's the sacredness that's at the core of our psychology, and which we must celebrate together in order for it to be fertile, in order for us to thrive. And I was talking yesterday with my friend Georgia, who's my personal trainer. And this came up, the religious aspect of the Great Divide, that there is on the part of the Republican side a view that the Democrats essentially want a soulless public life, whether or not they individually have or celebrate soul. They don't want to do it communally. And this is 100% correct. In my opinion, that's a correct perception that Republicans have about Democrats, that on the whole, they want to keep religion separate from public life, while Republicans, on the whole, very much want public life to be soulful. And both sides view it as religion. I'm saying there's a huge difference between religion and soulfulness, that we need soulfulness, all of us, and we need it publicly. But it's not religion, it's the source of religion. Soulfulness is the natural condition of the way our psychology has evolved to be, that it's founded from this sense of awe, experience of awe, and sense of the sacred in ourselves and in the world we come from. That's a psychological phenomena, and it is what makes us soulful. We must celebrate soulfulness. That is not the same as celebrating religion. And with some talking, it's my hope that Republicans can say, well, okay, if we have to distinguish between, psychological and religious meaning of the word soulful in order to have a soulful public life, okay, we'd go along with that. So long as Democrats can say, well, so long as soulful refers to psychological phenomena and not religious, beliefs, then yeah, okay, we could go along with that too. And so then you have soulfulness in public life, which you absolutely need to thrive as a species. And just, there doesn't seem to be any way around it, which is why we're struggling and we're faltering and our steps are unsteady and our hearts are bent heavy with the load of anger and a fair dose of hate, a double dose. And so we need to talk more about this, spirituality, soulfulness, as a psychological phenomena, and and to see that we own the sacred scriptures in the sense that they are our ancestors' expressions of feelings and thoughts that well up from within, from the psychological experience of the sacred. Um, and in that regard, then, there's uh, it's an easier path at that point to help see the difference between psychological spirituality and religion, and see them as a source, one of the other. Okay, so that's where we're going to go. So, I have. I guess I won't tell you about the books that I'm relying on. That'll take too much time. Let's finish up Hoffer today so we can move on tomorrow. Okay, so on page 33, so we're still talking about The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, written in 1951. On page 33, he's this is part of the section of the book that deals with where you might find converts to hate movements, to mass movements that typically include hate. And in particular, he's discussing the role of the undesirables in human affairs, as I went on about yesterday, perhaps too much. So one of the sources that he sees is the abjectly poor. Now, and he means, he's describing people who really spend most of the hours of their day trying to figure out how to get enough to eat. And what he's saying is these people are not likely converts to, some kind of a mass movement, because they just don't have the energy left. That their condition doesn't make them inclined towards addressing social issues that might benefit them. They're just too whopped by the simple task of getting something to eat between now and midnight. And so what he's saying in general is very important to us, because it's been part of our own recent experience. What he's saying is that just being miserable does not automatically generate discontent. He said, discontent is far more likely to occur, meaning the people who are getting the shaft economically might, join a movement to do something about it at the point when things start to improve. Once you gain some improvements, some benefits, when life gets a little bearable, then you want more. And I'm going to phrase it this way. He gives some examples from the Soviet Union, from France at the time of the revolution. He says that, de Tocqueville points out that in France, the 20 years prior to the revolution resulted in a significant increase in alleviating the burdens of the poor. But that's exactly what made them angry enough about the failure to have more when they launched the revolution. And he says the Soviet Russia had a pretty difficult situation to deal with. At one point, when they had achieved some small improvement in the condition of the average people. And he says this is interesting because he wrote this in 51, remember. The most dangerous moment for the Soviets will be when a considerable improvement in the economic condition of the Russian masses has been achieved and the iron totalitarian rule somewhat relaxed. And of course, that's what happened. Gorbachev was, blessed with an opportunity that arose because things had improved enough that people could see the situation being a lot better in and they really pushed hard for it, and he found it in his best interest. He 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 profoundly had a good heart, uh, and his good quality was stirred that this was a moment of opportunity. Um, so he's saying on page 34, the intensity of discontent, um, gets larger as the chances as things improve. Um, so, and he makes this point a number of times in a number of ways. I want to make a generalization. To me, in my opinion, hope changes our expectations. When things improve and we have a hope that they may improve more, then we expect that they will continue to improve more. Hope has given us the energy to have enough confidence and high expectations for what's coming next, that it'll be a continued improvement. And I think that essentially our experience with Martin Luther King is in that category. He raised our hopes. He raised the hopes of all of us that things could be better between us on social justice, on the civil rights in broadly spoken, and the hopes brought a willingness to press for change in my generation. And we did press for change, and we succeeded in making substantial changes. But we also succeeded in raising expectations beyond just what happened, what important improvements were made in the 60s and 70s, the and we're now in a posture where a lot of young people still have hope, and their situation isn't, remotely like the desperate poor. Um, in that, there's enough people with enough going on in their lives. They have the energy to hope for more and the expectation that hope brings. Well, those people are, raising discontent again with circumstances that my generation thought was a pretty good improvement. And we've been, like nice, polite, older people, um, kind of thinking, well, gee, we did a pretty good job. Yeah, well, that was 40 years ago. And, 50 years ago. And a lot of young people have been born since, and read their history. Have been brought up on Dr. King, and are looking around for, hey, where in the hell is the continuation? So hope changes our expectations. Martin Luther King certainly raised all of our hopes, and it's an error on the part of people like me, who until very recently didn't really see this, um, to think that there won't be a continuation of pressure arising from hopes, partly realized, for more things being achieved, more hopeful things actually being brought to bear. And so it's helped me a lot to see some of the great troubles of recent years and begin to appreciate that I was resting on my laurels inappropriately. And even though I'm old, I still should be aware about raised hopes changing our expectations, and that doesn't stop, thank goodness. People keep wanting to move along the road and not just stop and, say, my goodness, look how far we've come. Every now and again, you need to do some stopping and, have a tipple in favor of, okay, we've come some ways, good for us. But then you got to get back on the road. And, um, I've had a hard time appreciating that. And I confess it immediately. I'm very grateful to my grandchildren. They have been, pushing hard on the idea of white privilege, then I really hadn't seen myself in that context, in that light, and it's been helpful. So another thing that he's talking about here, back to Hoffer, is there's what he calls there's a big difference in whether your hope for something is something at hand, something that's going to happen soon, or whether it's something distant. So if it's a hope for something that's supposed to happen soon, then you're pushing real hard for it. You could possibly join a mass movement for it. But if it's something that's a distant hope, then you tend to be more patient, and I think that's probably true. Um, and it bears some mind for our consideration of our current Great Divide. People want immediate changes of various kinds, or they want to revoke recent changes of various kinds, and they want it now. And that's what this is really all about. Simply put, some people feel that too much, too far has happened, and they want to turn the clock back. And some feel that way too little and way too slowly is a fair description of our situation, and they want to speed the clock up. And, that's probably the core. Okay, so again, we've talked several times, I think, in recent days about the burden of freedom. Being responsible for our choices is a burden. When you're beaten down and have no choice, you have a freedom from responsibility, a certain kind of freedom. It's ridiculous to think about it in those terms, but it's true. And then when possibilities arise, now you have to make choices. And now immediately, some people feel burdened with, oh my, I'm not going to make the right choices. I don't have, you know, I don't have the right energy. I don't have the background. I don't have the training. I don't have the experience. I didn't have the proper upbringing. I don't have, the economic and social network in place. I'm on my own here, and I'm scared out of, my mind. I think I'll join a group, and they'll tell me all the things that I should choose, and I escape responsibility. Uh, so that some people's personal lives are untenable because they're living as individuals separated from society, and they feel this huge burden of responsibility for their choices, and they want to join a movement to escape this responsibility. As I said when we talked about this a few days ago, as an aside here, I think the problem for these people is that they're not participating in the gift of each other. That we need the gift of each other. We need to share hope, because of facing death, hate, necessity, and unfairness alone is overwhelming, and will give you this sense that you won't be able to meet the responsibility of living as a free person, making choices, and being responsible for them. So you could live as a free person and make choices and be responsible for them if you were also deeply social. You were rooted in the gift of each other and participating actively with family and friends and community. And that would give you the extra burst of energy and enthusiasm and sense that you can trust yourself, that you need in order to accept the burden of freedom, the responsibility for your choices. And again, in time, we need to point out that this is a very recent burden, that essentially, until such time as we became only in something 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, sufficiently able to be able to conceive of ourselves as an object of our own thoughts, do we hold ourselves as morally responsible for our choices. So if a child does something horrible, it's not a crime and it's not a sin. a child under 7 or so. If a 10-year-old does something horrible, it's a crime and it's a sin. And the difference is the psychological evolution development that occurs in those few years, and it's paralleled by there was a time just a few thousand years ago when we were all under 7 in this sense that we didn't have the capacity to view ourselves as an object of our own thoughts. So we acted intuitively and instinctively, but we couldn't stop before we acted and say, okay, let's apply experience. Let's think about this a little bit. Didn't we do this yesterday and didn't it not turn out well? And, can we live with the consequences of what we're proposing? Are there better alternatives? Well, we couldn't do that until very recently. So this whole burden of freedom, the responsibility for our choices, is very recent. And when you consider that, it's amazing. I mean, it's perfectly understandable that we find it hard to live together in large numbers because, it's we're still very, very young in the sense of just barely being a few years of experience as living as adults, people responsible for our choices. And in the process of worshiping our individuality and our individual intelligence, we've lost a good deal of our sense of our sociability and sense of how critical being social is to each other. So he points out on page 37 that people prefer equality more than freedom. That even that poverty, this you have to read through a series of pages, but poverty itself, especially extreme poverty, is not as likely to result in these kind of mass movements, including big chunks of hate, as inequality is. The inequality really grates, and people want equality and fraternity so much that they'll give up personal freedom in order to get those things. So they could stay an individual and be social, and in the process gain the energy and also the fraternity, and then they could together work to try to make things more equal than they are at any given time in the history of a people. And they'd be then having fraternity and freedom and individual responsibility and be working on the problems of inequality, which will always be with us and are always a concern. But if they don't have that sense of sociability in their individual lives, then their individual lives can become really scary, and they'll give up their freedom in order to join a movement in which they get a sense of oneness with the other members and equality between the members. And he talks in negative terms that people are afraid to have their inferiority exposed, so they don't like living in the real world where people compete and people constantly, judge others. And there's all kinds of settings, tests, commitments, critical business matters where you're essentially being tested, and you need to compete well enough to keep your self from feeling inferior. And if you're living an isolated life, you might well want to turn away from the kind of democratic world where there is constant competition because you feel you're not going to succeed in that world. So then you decide that you embrace some mass movement that wants to take away all competition and avoid all of those problems where you feel your inferiority will no longer be judged because everybody's made equal by law. And so again, it seems to me that the way to deal with this is to for the individual to be reminded of his sociability and share hope. In other words, sharing hope is the key to your living your sociability. So real quickly, Hoffer talks about demagogic propaganda. He talks again more about misfits, and some misfits are only temporarily misfitted. Their circumstances, are temporary, but they'll get back on their feet. They used to be on their feet, but others have a complete separation from themselves, and they're really just husks of people. And these kinds of misfits are, in Hoffer's opinion, never going to join a movement because, like the desperately poor, they just don't have the energy. He also talks about people with unlimited possibilities. People with wealth and circumstance and natural gifts that could be used incredibly. And that sometimes these people want to escape the responsibility for choice. Again, presumably because they don't share hope, they don't feel they're part of the gift of each other, and they don't think their own resources are adequate, even though the resources are far superior to others. So these people may well join a mass movement. Um, and people that are bored with the self. He talks about people who view their own individual self as vile, as barren. Again, this is people who are not sharing hope. Um, and he talks about losing oneself in the oneness of the congregation, joining a religious movement, and feeling strong oneness there, and substituting that for a self that is vibrant and alive and also social. If you just have sociality, if you surrender your individuality, then you're not living the gift of your own life. And in that case, your connection to others is inadequate because you're not bringing yourself to it. You're wallowing in the togetherness without bringing yourself in it. We need self and other, and so everything he talks about, and he goes on and on and on and on with details, specific examples, wonderful insight. It's all developing the point. There's a huge amount of psychological phenomena that are involved in these mass movements, and they're from all over the place. So it's a fair conclusion that there's no way that we can or end mass movements. There's no way that we can end the Great Divide. But we can see the importance of self and other, of our own psychology and the gift of each other. And in so doing, we take the hate part out of the Great Divide to a large extent, to an adequate extent that we can live with the rest of it. And I think I had thought mass movements, had more to do with economics and in particular circumstances than with psychology. And the key aspect of his book is it has a lot to do with psychology. And while he didn't say so because he wasn't thinking in those terms, I'm thinking in terms of self and other, of the gift of life and the gift of each other. And in those terms, I see constantly, that we'll always have people who, are struggling with self and other. There's something wrong with self or there's something wrong with other. So we'll always have mass movements. But we can still, by working to celebrate self and other, and celebrate nature's wisdom, in the name of sharing hope, we can reduce the hate. And I think that's a long-term goal that we can patiently pursue. Okay, enough for today. See you tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.